June 23, 1942. At Pembrey Airfield in South Wales, Royal Air Force spotters peered through binoculars as a sleek German fighter descended from the clouds and lined up for landing alarms should have been blaring, and anti-aircraft guns should have been tracking the intruder. But something about the approach seemed off. The Focke-Wulf 190 touched down smoothly on the grassy strip and rolled to a halt beside the control tower. The engine went silent. The canopy slid open. Oberleutnant Armin Faber of Jägerschwader. Two climbed out, removed his leather flight helmet, and glanced around at the strange buildings nearby. A chill ran through him. The aircraft parked on the field weren't Messerschmitts. They were Spitfires. The uniforms rushing toward him weren't Luftwaffe gray, but Royal Air Force blue. And in that instant, Faber realized his terrible mistake, the same revelation simultaneously thrilling British intelligence officers. Across southern England, Germany's deadliest fighter, the same aircraft that had been cutting down Allied pilots for months, the mysterious, seemingly unbeatable machine, had just been handed to Britain in perfect condition by a pilot who thought he'd landed safely in France. The intelligence gain was enormous, and what American test pilots would later uncover from this aircraft would forever change how Allied fighters battled the Luftwaffe. For 8 long months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been the nightmare of every Allied pilot across the Channel. It first appeared in the skies over France in September 1941, and from the very first encounter, RAF pilots knew they were facing something extraordinary. Squadron leader J.E. Johnson, who would go on to become Britain's top-scoring ace, faced the FW-190 in early 1942 and barely lived to tell the tale he later wrote. It was faster than our Spitfire Mark Verses, both in level flight and in a dive. It could roll faster, and its firepower was devastating. For the first time in the war, British fighters were completely outmatched. The numbers told the same grim story. RAF losses over France skyrocketed during the first half of 1942. Veterans who had survived the Battle of Britain were being taken down by an opponent they simply couldn't equal. The FW-190 could dive away from Spitfires, roll out of combat faster, and tear them apart with 4 20mm cannons. When American pilots arrived in Britain, flying their new P-47 Thunderbolts, they were warned immediately, don't dogfight an FW-190. Don't try to roll with it. Don't chase it into a dive. The list of mistakes to avoid was long. The list of tactics that worked was painfully short. Intelligence officers were desperate for answers. What made the FW-190 so effective? What weaknesses could be exploited? But they needed a working aircraft to study, and every wreck recovered in Britain had been too damaged to reveal its secrets. Then Armin Faber made the mistake of a lifetime. Before we move on, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you already knew about the FW-190. Drop a comment below and tell me if the story is new to you. And if you enjoy this kind of deep historical storytelling, make sure to subscribe. It takes a ton of research to get these details right, and your support makes it worth it. Oberleutnant Armin Faber wasn't some inexperienced rookie. At just 21, he already had multiple kills to his name and was a respected pilot in Jägerschwader, 2, the elite Richthofen fighter wing. On June 23, 1942, he was flying as part of a fighter sweep across the English Channel, escorting German bombers striking coastal targets. The mission had gone smoothly until the flight home. Somewhere over the Channel, while maneuvering aggressively in combat with British fighters, Faber lost his bearings. Heavy cloud cover hid the coastline completely. The sun's position gave Faber misleading cues about his direction. When he finally broke through the clouds and spotted green countryside with an airfield below, His brain made a simple yet disastrous assumption. He thought he was over France, looking down at a Luftwaffe base. In reality, he was flying over Wales, descending toward RAF Pembry. Looking back, the mistake seems unbelievable, but spatial disorientation in combat was far more common than militaries like to admit. Pilots flying at high speeds through thick cloud cover, pulling heavy G-forces that affected blood flow to the brain, often lost their sense of orientation. During the dogfight, Faber had unknowingly made a 180-degree turn and never realized it. When he landed and noticed the Spitfires around him, he tried to restart his engine and take off again. But it was already too late. RAF ground crews had surrounded the aircraft. Within minutes, he was captured, and British intelligence had full access to a perfectly preserved Focke-Wulf 190A3 sitting right on their runway. The reaction at RAF headquarters bordered on euphoria. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, head of Fighter Command, immediately ordered the aircraft transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough for detailed testing. Every component was to be examined, measured, and recorded. Within 48 hours, the FW-190 was at Farnborough under the scrutiny of Britain's best aviation engineers. What they discovered explained everything Allied pilots had been reporting from the front lines. The aircraft was an engineering marvel. If the Spitfire represented elegant design and aerodynamic grace, the FW-190 was the embodiment of raw practicality and lethal efficiency. Its BMW 801 radial engine generated 1,700 horsepower, far more than the Spitfire Mark V's 1,470. But it wasn't just power that made the German fighter so deadly. Its greatest advantage was its roll rate, the speed at which it could flip from one bank to another. The seemingly small characteristic turned out to be revolutionary in dogfights. Whenever a Spitfire tried to follow the FW-190 through rapid rolling maneuvers, it simply couldn't keep up. The German pilot could change direction, gain position, and line up shots before the British pilot could react. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew the captured FW-190 extensively, instantly understood why so many Allied airmen had been killed. The ailerons were incredibly light and responsive at all speeds, he wrote. You could throw this plane around the sky effortlessly. The Spitfire demanded muscle and precision. The FW-190 felt as if it moved by thought alone. Its firepower was just as intimidating. The FW-190A3 was armed with four 20mm MG-151 cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. A mere 2-second burst unleashed more explosive force than a Spitfire Mark Fw could deliver in 10 seconds. Because the weapons were mounted close to the fuselage, they created a dense, concentrated impact pattern that shredded targets at combat range. Testing also revealed why the FW-190 could always escape in a dive. Its heavier weight and streamlined shape gave it unmatched diving performance. Spitfire pilots who tried to follow could only watch helplessly as the German fighter pulled away, but the tests also exposed weaknesses. And this was where the intelligence became priceless. The FW-190's powerful radial engine suffered from cooling problems at high altitude. Above 20,000 feet, its performance dropped sharply. Pilots reported losing power and struggling with overheating in thinner air. In contrast, the Spitfire's Merlin engine thrived at high altitudes, performing better the higher it climbed, and the same heavy frame that made the FW-190 stable in a dive made it less agile in prolonged turning fights. It could outroll a Spitfire, but not outturn it. If an Allied pilot could lure an FW-190 into a sustained horizontal turning battle, the advantage suddenly flipped in the Spitfire's favor. One of the most crucial discoveries American engineers made was that the FW-190's controls became incredibly heavy at high speeds. During dives over 400 miles per hour, pilots needed immense physical strength just to pull the aircraft out. This created a brief but critical vulnerability. If an Allied pilot could follow the FW-190 through its dive and strike, as the German pilot struggled against his own controls, a successful attack became possible. British intelligence immediately began issuing tactical bulletins to RAF squadrons. But they also made a strategic move that would have a lasting impact on the air war. They invited American test pilots to Farnborough to fly the captured German fighter for themselves. In August 1942, U.S. Army Air Force pilots arrived in Britain to study Germany's prized aircraft up close. What they learned would go on to save hundreds of American lives. Major Cass Hu, one of the first Americans to test fly the captured FW-190, wrote a detailed report that was soon distributed to every fighter group preparing to deploy to Europe. His conclusions were straightforward and tactical. The FW-190 will outperform any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet if the German pilot knows his stuff, he wrote. Our advantage lies in altitude. Above 25,000 feet, our P-47s and later Spitfires have the edge. Force them higher, and we win. Fight them low, and we die. That single piece of intelligence fundamentally reshaped American air combat tactics in Europe. When P-47 Thunderbolt units began flying missions in 1943, their doctrine centered on high-altitude engagements. Bomber escorts flew as high as possible, and fighter patrols operated above 25,000 feet whenever they could. When German aircraft tried to engage, American pilots would climb even higher, forcing FW-190s into thin air where their engines lost power. The captured FW-190 also played a major role in shaping American aircraft development. Engineers at Wright Field carefully studied its superior roll rate, inspiring modifications to the ailerons on both the P-47 and P-51 to make them more agile. The tight wing root gun placement of the German fighter influenced how American designers approached weapons concentration. Even the FW-190's cockpit layout, built for maximum combat efficiency, left its mark on U.S. fighter design. But perhaps the most valuable insight of all was realizing that the FW-190 was not unbeatable. It was a brilliant machine with clear strengths, but also exploitable flaws. Allied pilots who had once feared its legend now understood exactly how to counter it. They knew its limits, and for the first time, they had the confidence to face it head-on. By late 1943, the balance of power in the skies had shifted dramatically. American P-47s and P-51s were now engaging FW-190s at higher altitudes, where the Allies held the upper hand. The RAF's new Spitfire, Mark 9, powered by an upgraded Merlin engine, could now match or exceed the FW-190's performance across most altitudes. Both sides knew they were flying aircraft designed for different strengths, and tactics evolved accordingly. The kill ratios began to swing in favor of the Allies. German FW-190 losses rose steadily as Allied pilots exploited the intelligence gained from Faber's mistake. Luftwaffe aces began noticing that their opponents were no longer falling into old traps. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, one of Germany's top FW-190 aces, noted in late 1943 that American pilots had clearly studied the aircraft. They know better than to follow us through rolling scissors, he wrote in his logbook. They force us high, where our engines struggle. They've learned. The captured FW-190 remained at Farnborough for the rest of the war, serving as a vital reference for analyzing new German variants as they emerged. When the improved FW-190D9 Dora appeared in late 1944 with its inline engine, Allied intelligence immediately compared it to Faber's original aircraft, quickly identifying how German engineers had attempted to solve the high-altitude performance issues. After the war, aviation historians analyzed just how significant Faber's blunder had been. The intelligence gathered from examining the fully intact FW-190 was distributed to thousands of Allied pilots through tactical manuals, training films, and demonstration flights. The knowledge shaped aircraft development, combat tactics, and strategic planning across multiple Allied air forces. Captain Eric Brown, the test pilot who flew more captured enemy planes than anyone else, later wrote, "Faber's navigation error gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design." Every strength of the FW-190 was documented, and every weakness systematically exploited. That one aircraft, he concluded, probably saved more Allied lives than any other single intelligence breakthrough of the entire war. The irony wasn't lost on the Germans. When Luftwaffe intelligence learned what had happened, one officer reportedly remarked, "We spent months trying to capture a Spitfire, Mark 9 intact, so we could study its improvements. The British didn't even have to try. We handed them our best fighter ourselves." Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in a Canadian POW camp. He survived, returned to Germany after the conflict, and lived quietly until 1976. Luftwaffe records suggest he was initially blamed for losing the aircraft, but later reviews admitted that combat disorientation could strike even the best pilots. The real mystery was why German intelligence had assumed the British would never recover a complete FW-190 in the first place. The story of Faber's captured fighter carries a timeless lesson about technological advantage in war. When the Focke-Wulf 190 first appeared in 1941, it represented a quantum leap in fighter design, faster, deadlier, and more advanced than anything the Allies could field. For almost a year, it dominated the skies. But that dominance vanished the moment Allied engineers were able to examine one in person. No aircraft is flawless. Every design involves trade-offs. The FW-190's superiority at low altitude came at the expense of high-altitude performance. Its incredible roll rate made its controls heavy at top speeds. Its heavy armament added devastating firepower, but also extra weight that reduced agility. Once Allied pilots understood those compromises, they could exploit them and turn the tide. Today, the FW-190 stands as one of World War II's most iconic fighter aircraft. Preserved examples in aviation museums showcase its brilliance as a piece of German engineering. Yet its legacy will always be tied to the intelligence windfall that exposed its secrets. In the complex balance of wartime advantage, one pilot's brief disorientation over the English Channel turned Germany's most feared weapon into an open book. The FW-190 that Armin Faber mistakenly delivered to Britain became the plane that taught the Allies how to win. The lesson still resonates through military history. Superior technology is powerful, but superior intelligence is decisive. And sometimes the greatest victories don't come from massive battles or daring assaults, but from one simple mistake that gives your enemy exactly what they've been searching for. The FW-190 might have remained an untouchable legend, an aircraft that terrorized Allied pilots through fear as much as through performance. Instead, it became a tool of instruction studied by every Allied airman who would later defeat it. One navigational error, one unintended landing, one priceless stroke of luck that changed the entire air war over Europe. That's how America gained access to Germany's secret fighter, and how a single moment of confusion in the sky shifted the balance of power above it.